Should we start now? Very good morning to all of you. I'm Neeta Singh, Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, Banaras University, Varanasi. I welcome you all to this lecture, which is being organized by the joint collaboration of Bhagwan Sheryansnath Jain Studies Fund, B.H.U, and Department of Philosophy and Religion, B.H.U. Today we have with us Sir Dr. Anand Jayprakash Vaidya from San Jose State University, California, USA, and he'll be speaking on the topic Logical Pluralism and Jain Logic. The full title of the paper for the talk is Can Jain Contributions to Dialectic and Debate Contribute to the Contemporary Debate over Logical Pluralism? An exploration with some suggestions. Dr. Anand Jayprakash Vaidya is presently an associate professor of philosophy in San Jose State University, Northern California, and occasional director of the Center for Comparative Philosophy as well. His research interests are epistemology, philosophy of mind, critical thinking, Indian philosophy, and many others. He offers courses on logical theory, ethical theory, philosophy of economics and justice, early and late modern philosophy, and Asian philosophy. He is currently working on numerous research projects containing the epistemology of necessity, possibility, and essence, theories of understanding, perception, and intuition, comparative examinations of classical Indian and Anglo-Australian analytic theories of mind, knowledge, and rationality. The debate over logical pluralism and logical monism, as well as the normative role of logic in rationality, the capabilities approach to justice, and virtue theoretic approaches to the value of critical thinking in democracy. He has presented more than 100 papers in 4 different continents, published approximately 60 research papers, articles, and monographs in a number of prestigious journals. He has written and edited 12 books, 2 on professional ethics and 2 on business ethics. Along with this, 4 on history of Western philosophy. And he's just going to publish a book on epistemology and business ethics, volume 2. So we have already listened to him once, but it was an online event. And today is the opportunity to our students that they can interact with Dr. Anand Jayprakash Vaidya in person. So welcome him with applause. And the session is to be presided over by Sir Professor P.K. Mukhopadhyay, and Sir needs no introduction at all. Still, it's for those who are new in the hall or present online that Professor Mukhopadhyay is a former head and professor of philosophy from Jadavpur University, Kolkata. He's an erudite student of Professor Gopinath Bhattacharya, who was indeed a great and well-known philosopher. And Professor Mukhopadhyay is specialized in Indian logic, especially Nyaya, as well as Western logic. His works include Indian realism, a rigorous descriptive metaphysics, Gangesha's theory of linguistic performance, religion, a discourse in realist philosophy, and many others. He has published hundreds of research papers in national and international journals. So we are glad to have you with us, sir. And we are privileged enough to host this lecture in which 2 stalwarts of Indian philosophy and logic are going to address this department. And now, since it's our tradition that before initiation of any academic or cultural event, we recall the founder of this university, Pandit Mahamana Madan Mohan Malviji, and pay our tribute to him. We also remember the supreme goddess of knowledge for an auspicious commencement and the uninterrupted accomplishment of the program. So I request to the respected chair of the session, honorable speaker, chairperson of the BSJSF and head of the department to come forward for lighting the lamp and garlanding the bust of Mahamana Malviji. Meanwhile, I would like to recite a few lines from the Bhaktamar Stotram, the Jain Mangalacharan. Shri Adinathaya Namaha. Bhaktamara Pradatamouli Prabhadam Udyotakam Dalita Papatamo Vitanam Samyak Pranamya Jinapada Yugam Yugadav Alambanam Bhavajale Patanam Jananam Yah Sanstutah Sakala Vangmaya Tattva Bodhat उद्भूत बुद्धि पटुभिः सुरलोकनाथैः स्तोत्रैर्जगत त्रियतय चित्तहरैरुदारैः स्तोष्ये किलाहमपि तं प्रथमं जिनेन्द्रम् बुद्ध्या विनापि विबुधार्चितपादपीठ स्तोतुं समुद्यतमतिर्विगत त्रपोऽहम् बालं विहाय जलसंस्थितं बिन्दुबिम्बम् अन्यः क इच्छति जनः सहसा ग्रहीतुम् दृष्ट्वा भवन्तमनिमेषविलोकनीयम् नान्यत्र तोषमुपयाति जनस्य चक्षुः पीत्वापयः शशिकरद्युतिदुग्धसिन्धो क्षारं जलमजलनिधेरसितुं क इच्छेत्. Thank you so much to all the dignitaries. Now, I would like to invite Miss Sneha and Kajol for the rendition of Kulgit. Please welcome.
मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी राजधानी मधुर मनोहर अतीव सुंदर ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी राजधानी ये तीनों लोकों से न्यारी काशी सुज्ञान धर्म और सत्य राशि बसी है गंगा के रम्य तट पर ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी राजधानी नए नहीं है ये ईट पत्थर है विश्वकर्मा का कार्य सुंदर रचे है वेद्या के भव्य मंदिर ये सर्व सृष्टि की राजधानी राजधानी यहाँ की है ये पवित्र शिक्षा कि सत्य पहले फिर रक्षा बिके हरिश्चंद्र थे यहीं पर ये सत्य शिक्षा की राजधानी राजधानी वेद ईश्वर की सत्यवाणी बने जिन्हें पढ़ के ब्रह्म ज्ञानी हे व्यास जी ने रचे यहीं पर ये ब्रह्म विद्या की राजधानी राजधानी वो मुक्ति पद को दिलाने वाले सुधर्म पथ पर चलाने वाले यही फले फूले बुद्ध शंकर ये राज ऋषियों की राजधानी राजधानी सुरम्य धाराएं वरुणासी नहाए जिनमें कबीर तुलसी भला हो कविता का क्यों ना आकर ये वाग विद्या की राजधानी राजधानी विविध कला अर्थशास्त्र गायन गणित खनिज औषधि रसायन प्रतीचि प्राची का मेल सुंदर ये विश्वविद्या की राजधानी राजधानी ये मालवीय जी की देशभक्ति ये उनका साहस, ये उनकी शक्ति, ये मानवीय जी की देशभक्ति, ये उनका साहस, ये उनकी शक्ति प्रकट हुए है नवीन होकर, ये कर्मवीरों की राजधानी, राजधानी। मधुर मनोहर अतीब सुंदर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी। मधुर मनोहर अतीब सुंदर, ये सर्व विद्या की राजधानी, राजधानी।
Thank you, Sneha and Kajol. After this beautiful rendition of our Kulgeet, I request Sir Professor Mukul Mehta, the chairperson of the Bhagwan Sheryansnath Jain Studies Fund (B.H.U), to kindly facilitate our respected speaker and president with all. Sir, first yeah. So, sir, please, Ms. Akanksha and Aradhana, come forward to assist, sir. I request you, sir, to first welcome our chairperson, Professor Mukhopadhyay, sir. So you are most welcome in our department. Now, sir, I request you to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Anand Jayprakash Vaidya. So this one is from Sheryansnath Studies Fund, Bhagwan Sheryansnath Jain Studies Fund BHU, especially from that fund. Now, sir, please welcome our speaker, Dr. Vaidya. You're welcome, sir. Please give a big applause. Thank you so much to all of you, sir. And now I request to the head of the department, Professor Anand Mishra, to welcome our dignitaries. So please.
Hari Om. Honorable Chairperson Professor P.K. Mukhopadhyay ji, our learned Professor Anand Jayprakash Vaidya, Professor Mukul Mehta, Chairperson Bhagwan Sheryansnath Jain Studies Fund B.H.U, convener of the lecture Dr. Neeti Singh ji, our colleagues, students, scholars, offline and online, I welcome you all in a special lecture on logical pluralism and Jain logic. Friends, this is really a great privilege for us that Professor Anand Vaidya is with us in person. Last year he delivered Chocolingo lecture series. He delivered a lecture in that series. At that time, we had a great desire to have it in future in person. Now he is present with us. So I welcome you in this seminar hall of BHU. When I contacted him, we talked about so many topics or subjects on which he could deliver a lecture. Finally, I requested him to deliver a lecture on history and development of logic. Then he suggested that it should be logical pluralism and Jain logic. Professor Vaidya, there could be no place better than this for this lecture on logical pluralism and Jain logic. As you know, this is perhaps the only department where, in fact, in all India, or one can say even abroad, where more than 80 students, they study Jainism, Jain philosophy. Professor Mehta teaches Jain studies to MA students, and as I told you, there are more than 80 students in the class. Nowhere in India you can see like that. But this is not the story of this year. In fact, this department has been the Center for Jain Studies. There is a great tradition of Jain studies here. Professor M.L. Mehta ji, Professor Sagar Mal Jain, now Professor M. Mukul Mehta. These people have been associated with Jain studies. So I welcome you again in this department that you are going to deliver a lecture on logical pluralism and Jain logic. I hope all the students and scholars would enjoy the lecture. I also welcome Professor P.K. Mukhopadhyay ji. He has been teacher of our teachers. Really, we are fortunate that he is with us today. When I invited him, he gladly accepted our invitation. I am really thankful to you, sir. I welcome you in this department in which you have delivered so many lectures. I also welcome the different scholars who are connected to the seminar, whether they are offline or online, our colleagues, students, and friends. I would not like to say that I welcome Professor M.R. Mehta. In fact, I am thankful to him that he actually associated with us to organize the lecture. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And without further ado, I invite today's speaker, Dr. Anand Jayprakash Vaidya, for his talk. Sir, please welcome.
Hello? Can you? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. I know that it seems like I am the one who is sort of supposed to tell you something, but if it's all to be honest about what the purpose of this trip is, the purpose is that I've come here to learn, not to tell you something, but more to collaborate. I hope that this is the beginning of a very long relationship between myself and the faculty at BHU and the students, as well as between my institution and this institution, for the purposes of collaborative research across many areas of world philosophy, of course, but in particular, for my interest, Indian philosophy. Today, I'm going to basically discuss an issue that I think could be very profitable for people in India to engage in. I will focus my attention on India, but I believe that this topic is actually something that we can talk about across various traditions. And what I will try to do is begin to lay the foundations for a discussion that doesn't focus so much in an area that has been explored historically in Indian philosophy, which is the area of formal logic, both between Western thinkers and Indian thinkers, but in an area that is a little bit more at a higher level, what we call the philosophy. Can we close the door? It's just it's way too loud for me. So I want to make sure that it's very clear. Like, what I'm going to try to do is, and there's a lot of information here. I have like over 47 slides to present of technical material. So there's a lot of stuff I'm going to be talking about. But the idea, if you want to know simply, is there is a contemporary debate that has started since 2006 in an area known as the philosophy of logic, which is the philosophical study of various questions about the metaphysics and epistemology and ontology of logic. And I am interested in generating ideas from classical Indian philosophy and contemporary Indian thinkers about how to engage this debate from the perspective of Indian thinkers. Now, as my research has taken me down the road, I've come to the conclusion that many of the prior discussions that occurred between Western logicians and Indian logicians focused more in the area of what's known as formal logic and less in the area of philosophical logic, or philosophy of logic, not philosophical logic. I could be corrected on that by those that are more wiser than me, but that's where my research has taken me. So today I will paint the picture of a potentially new project that we all can engage in. This is not full screen. Can you make it full screen? Yeah, it should be. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. It'll only work in full screen. Oh, okay, good. Okay, good. We'll try it this way. I'm used to doing it the other way. Okay, so there's an idea that is well known for logicians. It's called the logical consequence relation. So in English, and I would hope also in Sanskrit and in Hindi and other languages in India, the logical consequence relation is coded by the fact that we say phrases like B follows from A, or B is a consequence of A, or B must be true if A is true. We like to call this relationship, technically speaking in logic, the consequence relation. And now there is a question you can ask about the consequence relation as it occurs in English. And that question is, could there be more than one correct reading of such phrases? Okay. So a logical monist is someone who holds that there is only one correct reading of the phrase B as a consequence of A. And a logical pluralist is someone who holds that there's more than one correct interpretation of the phrase. Okay, now, strictly speaking, right now, there are people who advocate logical monism. That's Graham Priest, who's usually at the City University of New York or St. Andrews, and Timothy Williamson, who is at Oxford. And then there are people who are pluralists, like the people who wrote the original book in 2006, J.C. Beale and Greg Restall. They defend the idea that there are multiple ways to understand the consequence relation. So oftentimes when you're new to this subject, you might be like, I'm not really sure I understand what pluralism would be about. So there's an important historical fact in the 20th century that has nothing to do with Indian philosophy for the most part that can help you understand this. There were three schools around the turn of the 20th century that were very prominent in the philosophy of mathematics and in the philosophy of logic and in formal logic. They were mostly concerned with the correct interpretation of how to use logic within mathematics. So one school is known as the classical school. That's the one that most of you learn when you take an introduction to logic class. Another school is called the intuitionistic school, and yet another school is called the paraconsistent school. And each of these schools offer different rules governing the consequence relation. So each of them says, this rule is a good rule, this rule is a good rule, but this rule is a bad rule. Because we use the notion of validity to codify rules in different systems, one way to present the difference is simply to say that a classical story would hold that conjunction, disjunctive syllogism, and explosion are all valid. An intuitionistic system would hold two of those and say that disjunctive syllogism is invalid. And a paraconsistent system would hold two of them and say that explosion is invalid. So for the purposes of what's going on, the key idea, if you're not really that savvy into the literature, is just simply to understand the idea that in logic, we differentiate systems of logic by differences in rules. If two systems of logic have the same rules, for most intensive purposes, they're the same system. If they differ over their rules, then they're a different system. When I was growing up and studying formal logic at the University of California, Los Angeles, it was never, ever an option to say, couldn't all of these be correct? Or couldn't more than one of these be correct? Because the standard metalogical way in which you teach logic is to say, what we're talking about is that one of these is correct, and the history is that we're debating which one of these are correct. So if you read papers by, for example, Arnett Heiting, he will discuss why the intuitionistic system is better than the classical system. If you read papers by Graham Priest more recently, he will argue why the paraconsistent system is better than the classical or the intuitionistic system. So the debate was, what is the ultimate logical system that is correct? The background frame was that monism was true, only one correct system, but the debate was which one of these is correct. Then in 2006, some different people decided, isn't there a way we could possibly discuss this in a more pluralistic way? Couldn't we accept the idea that there might be more than one correct logic? So the standard interpretation right now of what the two options are in monism is that Tim Williamson argues for the classical system and Graham Priest argues for the paraconsistent system. One way to understand this is because of the differentiation in a rule. So explosion is a rule in logic. It basically says that anytime you have contradictory premises, anything follows from it. So the idea is that if you have P and not P in your premise set, then you can derive any conclusion. That's why it's called explosion, because you can explode everything you want as a conclusion from just those two premises. It's a very simple trick you learn in first order logic, but that's what explosion is. Paraconsistency is the idea that there are some true contradictions, which is a restriction on explosion by saying that only sometimes do things follow of a certain kind from a true contradiction, but not always. Okay, so that's the difference. Williamson is saying explosion is valid, and having a contradictory premise set is a bad thing. And Graham Priest is saying the explosion is invalid, and having a contradictory premise set might be good sometimes. Okay? So now we move from here into the framework for a new thing. So when J.C. Beale and Greg Restall wrote this book, what they were concerned with isn't the simple idea that there's more than one correct account of the consequence relation. They were concerned with the philosophical question, not the fact that there's many systems, but the philosophical question: how do you coherently generate the plurality? Right? It's one thing to sit there and say there are many different systems. It's another thing to say that there's a technique in philosophy that will generate the different kinds of pluralities. Okay? So the question, strictly speaking, isn't just a formal mathematical question. It requires deep philosophical investigation into the idea of what it is to generate plurality about the ultimate way in which we reason when we think logically. That was the idea. Okay, so there are 3 techniques for doing this. So one technique, the original one, is the model-based view, the one in the center. Now, the model-based view was created by Beale and Restall, working off of the work of one of the most famous important logicians in the 20th century. He had an idea that one way to understand when an argument is valid is by talking about quantification over models or cases. So when I say an argument is valid, for Tarski that meant that every interpretation of the non-logical constants in the premise set makes the conclusion true. So if the premise set is made true under every variation of non-logical constants, it will make the conclusion true. So what he is doing is he's taking the idea of the argument is good by saying that something about the notion of and, or, negation, material implication will hold constant between the premise sets and the conclusion. Okay, so this is the model theoretic account of validity offered by Tarski. It's a very, very important idea. Now, the idea that Beale and Restall had was that, well, wait a minute. Whenever you quantify over something, there's tacitly the thing you're quantifying over. Like you have some things you're quantifying over. So they said, what if we change the cases you're quantifying over? Okay, so he's saying in all cases where the premises are true, the conclusion is true. Okay, so now they're saying, what if you change the notion of case so that you have different cases? They then argued in their book that on the basis of changing the notion of case, you could in fact say that all 3 of the logics, classical, intuitionistic, and paraconsistent, are correct interpretations of the consequence relation because you have to use different cases in order to generate the model theoretic account. Okay, so there's a lot of complicated details here, but the key idea of this slide is not to give you a 4-day lecture on model theory, which is what it would take to go through all the details, but to help you see one main idea, that there are multiple paths to generating logical pluralism. So shortly after Beale and Restall defended their view, another group of philosophers, Ottavio Bueno and Scott Shalkowski, close friends of mine actually, defended another view. They said that in fact the model theoretic account is inferior to an account that's based on the core idea of what validity is, and that idea is necessity. Oftentimes when we teach what it means to say that an argument is valid, we say it's necessarily truth-preserving. The premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So on the basis of taking the notion of necessity, which is in the common sense English explanation of what it is for an argument to be valid, they then showed you could generate a form of pluralism. Okay, then another account was offered later by the famous philosopher of mathematics at NYU, Hartree-Field. He argued that, in fact, there's a different way to go, and that is based on the fact that we think that logic has a normative role to play in our reasoning. We often teach people the following. We say, hey, what logic is telling you how you should reason. It's not an account of the psychological processes by which you do reason. In fact, in cognitive science, we study this phenomenon all the time. There's a test. It's called the Wason selection task. In the Wason selection task, what I do is I give you a bunch of cards with letters on one side and numbers on the other side, and then I ask you, which cards do you have to turn over in order to check whether or not the following rule is true? If there's an even number on one side, there's a vowel on the other side. We can show through many studies repeatedly that most people fail on this simple task of understanding a material implication of the form P then Q with the standard material implication truth table. So that's a story about how good people are or how they do reason, and there are studies in evolutionary psychology about how people actually reason. But logic, according to some people, was not a story about how we do reason. It was a story about how we should reason. So Hartree-Field argues on the basis of this idea, the normativity of logic in relationship to reasoning, that there might be different norms for reasoning under which each of the different logics might be correct in that way. According to which norm you're following or which situation you find yourself in, there could be a different norm for how you should reason. So, big point on this slide, there are 3 different recognized ways to argue for logical pluralism. This point will eventually be clear to you in how it connects to Indian philosophy in just a couple of moments. So, what happened after Field's work is there became a debate about whether or not logic really should be understood in this normative way. Right? Should logic be understood as a story about how we should reason? Is that really the correct story? And another philosopher who's prominent in Australia, her name is Gillian Russell, argued that this is a mistake. It's always been a mistake. Logic is not a story about how we should reason primarily. It is not identical to ethics. It is identical to physics. What is the relationship here? Physics aims to tell us how the world is, not how it should be. It's trying to tell us the principles that govern the relationship between macroscopic bodies and microscopic phenomena. It's not telling us how particles should behave. It's telling us what are the principles that tell us how it does behave, right? That's a descriptivist stance. So she inherited from the position that physics is in the business of describing the world, that logic is in the business of describing something. It's not telling us how we should reason. It's telling us how something does work. And now the question is, if physics is about particle waves and functions and how they interact with one another, what is logic about such that it's describing something? And she came up with a very obvious answer from anybody who took an introduction to logic class. She said, oh, it's about truth preservation, right? There's this idea in logic that what we're trying to do is preserve the truth. That is why the definition of a material conditional, P implies Q, is only false in the case where the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Why? Because a material conditional is only interested in preserving the truth. So you're false if you go from true to false because you didn't preserve the truth. But if both the antecedent is false and the consequent is true, or the antecedent is false and the consequent is false, it turns out that the material conditional says it's true. Why? Because you didn't go from true to false. You went from false to true or false to false. So the idea is that the material conditional is in the business of truth preservation. Validity is in the business of necessary truth preservation. Ergo, logic is the study of truth preservation. And the question is, what is the correct description of how truth preservation works? Not how should we reason, that's a different question, right? The question is, what is the correct description of truth preservation? Here are 3 different descriptions of it: intuitionistic, classical, and paraconsistent. Okay, so she gives a different account, and her and Hartree-Field have somewhat of a day. So in more detail, I mean, we can go through this later, but the basic idea is that you need to keep in mind that if someone tells you logic is normative, they're trying to tell you logic is like ethics. Ethics tries to tell us how we should live our life. Logic tells us a subset of that. How should we regulate our reasoning? And then the other view is that if logic is descriptive, logic is like physics. It's in the business of describing something, just like physics tells us about particles and waves. What are the things it's in the business of describing? It's in the business of describing this very important thing we care about, truth preservation. Okay? So, there is another philosopher who was before all of these people. He existed around the 30s to the 50s. He was a big contributor to the school that I studied at, the University of California, Los Angeles. His name is Rudolf Carnap. And in a book he wrote called The Logical Syntax of the World, he also defended a principle about the nature of logic. And his view is kind of an alternative to the contemporary view. His view is that logic really isn't completely normative, nor is it completely descriptive. It's got its own sort of thing going on, but it doesn't fall neatly into, I'm going to tell you how you should reason, or I'm going to describe the world to you in some way. It's here to do something a little bit different. So, I will read to you just real quickly what one of the main ideas is, which is called the principle of tolerance. It is not our business to set up prohibitions, but to arrive at conventions. In logic, there are no morals. Everyone is at liberty to build up his own logic, his own form of language, as he wishes. Once the fact is realized that all the pros and cons of the intuitionist discussions are concerned with the forms of a calculus, questions will no longer be put in the form, what is this or that like? But instead we shall ask, how do we wish to arrange this or that in the language to be constructed? Or, from the theoretical standpoint, what consequences will ensue if we construct a language in this or that way? What is the ultimate upshot of what Carnap is saying? He is trying to promote the idea that, look, you can build a formal system, which formal logic is, you can build a formal system however you want. The question isn't what's going on with what you build. The question is, what can you do with it? And why is what you're going to do with it something important? So the main idea that he forwarded is that we don't need to think about logic in terms of it being something like ethics or physics. We need to think of it as a tool. We can build this tool however we want, just as we can build a screwdriver, a wrench, or a hammer. The question is, what are you going to do with it, and what is it good for? Because if you try to bang a nail in with a wrench, it might not be that interesting. And if you try to screw in a screw with a hammer, you might find that you fail. So Carnap is pursuing the idea that we can build formal systems and then we can assess them in terms of what we're trying to do. Okay? So later I will talk more about Carnap towards the end. Okay. So how do we move from this very contemporary debate that has some predecessors to the inclusion of Indian philosophy? Right. So I would like to argue, or I have argued already, that basically what we can do is we can build a bridge across Indian philosophy and Western philosophy. And we can argue that there are contributions from Indian discussions of logic that can contribute to this specific debate. Now, I believe that every single tradition of Indian discussion, every single traditional discussion of debate, dialogue, and inference, anumana, in Indian philosophy would have something to say about the debate I just talked about. But you can't really argue so generically. So the point of my argument is to explore one specific tradition, the Jaina tradition, and to start to build a bridge to show how we can evaluate whether or not Jaina contributions to debate and dialogue and inference could pertain specifically to this contemporary debate. I believe that because this debate is a new debate in Western philosophy of logic, that it has not really been considered by people working in Indian logic and Western logic before 1998. Now I think there's an opportunity to look at those things that people wrote in India and to build from their work a way of engaging this particular debate. That is the goal of what I'm doing. The goal of what I will be doing today is trying to build that bridge and convince you to a certain degree that there are textual sources we can look at in the Jaina tradition, and I'm very confident of the other traditions as well, that will speak to this debate so that we can make a new conversation, one that had not existed in the philosophy of logic between Indian philosophers and Western philosophers, going forward as this debate continues. That is the goal. Okay. So, in particular, there's two questions that are important. In what sense, if any, does the specific tradition contribute to logical theory? If the tradition contributes to logical theory, does it also contribute to the debate over logical pluralism? These are questions that specify how the investigation will proceed. So, can Jaina logic lead to a form of logical monism? That's one of the questions I'm interested in. Can Carnap's principle of tolerance work as a possible interpretation of Jaina logic? These are two ideas I'm working on. So I'm working out for you the way in which things can be possibly argued. There is no finality here. The fact is there are too many textual sources in Indian philosophy for us to look at. The real goal is to say, look, there's a debate, there are textual sources. If we look at them carefully and interpret them accurately with scholars who read the Sanskrit and Prakrit carefully, we probably will find interesting ideas that can then generate a response or an engagement with what's going on in the debate on logical pluralism. Okay, so for those of you who might not be aware, let's just give a version of the Saptabhangi. So where A, B, and C are variables ranging over standpoints, and P is a variable ranging over existential statements or predicative judgments, the sevenfold theory of predication can be presented as follows. From A, it is true that P. From B, it is false that P. From A, it is true that P. And from B, it is false that P. From C, it is unsayable whether P or not P. From A, it is true that P. And from C, it is unsayable whether P or not P. From B, it is false that P. And from C, it is unsayable whether P or not P. From A, it is true that P. From B, it is false that P. And from C, it is unsayable whether P or not P. This is the Saptabhangi. Now, let me give some commentary here about it. One of the things that I have been working on constantly for the last 5 years is the fact that many of the Indian scholars who commented on the Saptabhangi historically and still in the 20th century always were concerned, what is the correct interpretation of the Sanskrit rendering of these 7 types of judgments? That is a very powerful debate, but unfortunately, if all we ever do is debate what is the correct interpretation of the Saptabhangi, we will never get to the second question of whether or not any specific interpretation works in relationship to the debate over pluralism. So my goal for today would be to table the correct interpretation, because as I have seen in the literature, there are lots of different interpretations out there. I focused on the one I gave working with a scholar in New Zealand named Jaishankar Shah, who's a Nyayaka who's very well trained in logic, who worked with me to work out this interpretation. But I was reading recently Vilma Dasa's Saptabhangi Tarangi, where he gives a completely different interpretation, which is very, very interesting. So I'm now looking at his work to see what can we get from his version that might contribute differently. And I don't want to say in any way at all that the interpretive debate about the Saptabhangi is uninteresting. It's completely interesting to me, and it's very interesting to the history of Indian philosophers working on it. What I am worried about, though, is that we can't have a conversation cross-culturally if we're always just talking about the interpretation. We have to settle about one interpretation and see where it goes. This is how productive and creative philosophy is done, and that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, couple of points. So there's 2 basic truth values that you're aware of, truth and falsity. Unsayability is another truth value. The question that people ask is, are all 7 necessary? That is, can you do what's called in mathematics a reduction theorem? Can I show that really all 7 of the values can be reduced to some subset of them, like 4 of them? Some people say that in some interpretations, the 7 statements show that this endorses a form of paraconsistency because it accepts that there are true contradictions. I don't take that interpretation to be very plausible, because I think what they're basically trying to say is that it's all relative to a standpoint. So you're talking about standpoints. If standpoints are different, then you don't really get a contradiction. If it's true from standpoint A but false from standpoint B, that's not a contradiction because it's not true and false from the same standpoint. That's called parametric dependence, and we don't have the issue of parameter-free interaction between P and not P. It's always parameterized to Anaya. And then finally, the project I am now working on is what is the correct interpretation of Octavia, which is translated here as unsayable, but has also been translated as inexpressible. There's a research group working at Oxford and Harvard that I'm joining, where they will be discussing various interpretations of inexpressibility and ineffability in Buddhism and Indian philosophy, and my contribution is to bring out a discussion on the Jain notion of Octavia. There's a very wonderful paper by Jain around 1969, and in this paper he carefully, for 7 pages, goes through many different interpretations of what Octavia could be. So it's extremely important to understand the epistemology and logic being forwarded by the Jainas that we do look at this notion. But again, as I said for today, I'm open to discussing them and learning from you, but I don't have much more to say about my interpretation other than what I've offered. Okay, so one objection that you get right away, like this is like the first thing a logician who studies the logical consequence debate about pluralism and monism will say. They will tell you right away, from what you have shown me, it is impossible that Jainas had anything to say about the logical pluralism debate. That's a flat-footed rejection of my whole argumentative strategy. So let's now combat the most common response to the project I'm giving you. So the objection is basically, in the Saptabhangi, there is no presentation of a rule of inference. The consequence relation is about what set of rules of inference correctly captures the consequence relation. Ergo, whatever is going on in the Saptabhangi is categorically irrelevant. Okay, that's the objection. But there's a very simple response, which can be presented simply by a thought experiment concerning Aristotle. So imagine that Aristotle wrote the Metaphysics and told us in the Metaphysics that nothing can be true and false at the same time, or everything is either true or false. That is, he articulated the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of bivalence. But then he got bored and later died early, and he never wrote out the rules of categorical logic. He never told us anything about Barbara, Clarent, about all these different ways in which you can infer from two premises using quantity relations to a conclusion validly. I mean, he gave a whole table of all of them. He gave a method for determining it. But just to suppose he never wrote that, then I would be able to make the following argument. Aristotle never contributed to the consequence relation debate about monism versus pluralism because he never formulated any rules. But that's false, because he formulated the principle of non-contradiction. And the principle of non-contradiction controls the construction of rules. The metaphysics of logic is as relevant to the philosophical logic debate on logical pluralism than any specific set of rules are. And in fact, if you look at the intuitionistic school, what they were trying to do is look at the metaphysics of logic from an epistemological standpoint, and that's why they rejected things like double negation elimination as well as disjunctive syllogism, because the intuitionistic school believed that in order to prove something in mathematics, you must give what's known as a constructive proof. You cannot give a proof by reductio ad absurdum, because reductio ad absurdum shows you that something must be true because its opposite is false. But that isn't a way of showing something. That's a way of saying and pointing. It's like saying, it's got to be true. The other road must get to the city I want to go to because this one hit a dead end. But that's not what an intuitionist philosopher wanted in mathematics. What they wanted was the construction. They wanted the proof that you can see the surveyability between the premises that lead to the conclusion. So they epistemologically decided that disjunctive syllogism and double negation elimination were a problem, and they rejected them as rules in their system. So the metaphysics and epistemology of logic speaks heavily to the issue of how you construct rules. So it's completely irrelevant to say to a Jaina philosopher that your tradition cannot offer anything to this debate because you never formulated any rules. Okay? So the flat-footed objection against the contribution doesn't work. And in addition, we can make this same argument for the Nyaya tradition, and we can make the same argument based on Dharmakirti also in the Buddhist tradition. This argument should generalize because in general, philosophy of logic is about the metaphysics, epistemology, and ontology of logic, not any specific rules. Those rules are created on the basis of saying, this is what I think logic is about, right? The rules come after, but the statement of what it's about is primary. And the Jainas seem to be saying something, and I will say in a while what exactly that is, but they seem to be saying. So the initial objection goes away. Okay. So now let's get deeper into the trench. Let's actually try to find a specific way in which we can look at how the Jaina system or Indian logics in general can contribute specifically to this issue. So if someone tells you that this tradition from a certain group is contributing to a debate in logic, you must show how it contributes to logical theory, because logical theory is like ethical theory. In order to make a connection, you must talk about logical theory. So Thomas Hofweber is a famous logician in America who also works in philosophy of logic, and he has described many different ways in which the word logical theory is used in the West. My goal will be now to show that we can look at each of Hofweber's definitions and we can say, did the Jaina tradition contribute in this way? Did the Jaina tradition contribute in that way? And we can go one by one and answer the question. So let's do that now. Okay, so the first version. So Hofweber's first version is the idea that we use the word logic as the study of artificial formal languages, such as first-order, second-order predicate calculus, modal logic, and lambda calculus and categorical grammars. That is, what it is to talk about logic is to talk about artificial formal languages. But if we look at this notion and we look at the extant textual evidence up to the 17th century in the Jaina tradition, we are not probably going to find a lot of worked out logical stuff in formal notation. So if the claim is that logic is really this formal study, then the answer of whether the Jainas or the Nyayikas for that matter, or even the Buddhists contributed to the formal notion of logic is probably no. But is that a problem? No, it's not a problem, because there are three other notions we can still deal with. So we can let this one go and rest confident that there are other ways in which the contribution can be made. L2. So logic is the study of formally valid inference and logical consequence. That's actually the one we've been talking about. And someone might think, well, the Jain thinkers did not specify any rules of inference, as I just said, so they didn't really talk about this notion at all. I think that this is actually going to turn out to be false, and the reason why is because there seems to be textual evidence that the Buddhists, especially Dharmakirti, and various Jain thinkers, such as Manichayanandi, debated actual inferences. One of them is called the mango inference, which is a debate between the Buddhists and the Jains about whether or not an inference concerning the color and the taste of a mango is good. So this specific debate gives us textual evidence that the Jains and the Buddhists were concerned with what a good inference is in terms of specifying a rule. So that means that in sense number two, it's not fair to say that Jainas had no contribution to rules of inference, because if they were debating another school about something that is a valid rule, then they're debating what are the good rules, right? So that's a pretty straightforward argument. Okay, so logic is the study of logical truths. So someone might argue, but the Jains didn't specify any logical truths, so Jain thinkers didn't contribute to L3. But we might look at the sevenfold predication and think of it as in some way talking to us about logical truths. And the reason why is because if it is the case that the sevenfold theory of predication does not have a reduction proof that takes us from 7 to 4, for example, or 7 to 3, if there is no reduction, then we know that the combinations after 4 or even at 3 require a notion of a variable. because a variable has to be used in a higher order principle to say that what is occurring earlier can be combined. So at 5 and 6, we see it says it is false from some perspective and is unsayable from another perspective. So the word and is used temporally in a successive notion. Now it is from this perspective true, or now it is from this perspective false. Now it is unsayable. That notion of and time requires a notion of variables. Otherwise, how do you combine things? So that means that there's a higher order principle underneath the sevenfold theory that has variables in it. Those variables operating gives us the idea that they must have been aware of variable binding, and they must have been aware of how variables can work to make specific instances, such as creating 5, 6, and 7 in the sevenfold theory, as well as 3. So I'm not as sure that we can say that they didn't have a notion of a logical truth in mind, because pretty much when you get to the notion of a variable, you're in the position to start thinking about things that are true in virtue of logic alone. This is exactly what Tarski is talking about, and exactly what Aristotle is talking about when he gives the principle of non-contradiction. They're trying to tell us that there are certain ideas where the content of what is said is irrelevant. What is relevant is the abstract structure that puts things together. So P or not P is a tautology, and P and not P is a contradiction in Aristotelian classical logic. But the P's there don't matter. They're variables ranging over any sentential thing that can be substituted. That's what's going on here also. The Jains aren't telling us a specific logical truth, but they might be giving us the clue that they knew about variable binding and variable. So there could be a variable in the background that is relevant. Okay, the last notion is the study of general features or form of judgments. This is obviously the main sense in which the Jainas contributed, because what they basically did do was give us 7 forms of judgment. So in giving us 7 forms of judgment, they clearly answered this question. So if Hofweber is telling us one of the most common uses of the notion of logic is the notion of general forms of judgment, then the Jains win on that as a slam dunk. It's very easy for them to get that one off the ground. So now, at this stage, I have argued that there is one sense in which the Jains most likely didn't contribute at all to logic, and I've defended to different degrees 3 different ways in which they could have and did. So this last one is the one in which they did, and the other 2 is one in which they could have, to varying degrees depending on further textual evidence. So, but would it be fair to have a debate with Western logicians where we said only your notion of logic is the one we should be talking about? No. So in my view, what we should be doing is we should be exporting from classical Indian discussions the notion of anumana and where it is found in many texts. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go the opposite direction. I'm going to say, first, I considered what is going on with Hofweber's distinction. Now I'm going to talk from the perspective of an Indian philosopher thinking about debates between Dharmakirti and Manichayanandi and other people, Nyayakas and other Buddhists, and how those could also help. So one thing that has come to my attention in studying Pramana Shastra is the idea that anumana, where we talk about inference, is part of Pramana. So the idea is that there's a debate, and the debate is which of those things that are supposed to be valid means of knowing are correct ways of knowing. Charvakans deny the fact that anumana is a way of knowing about the world. They only accept pratyaksha. Now, other schools accept anumana. I think pretty much every other school accepts anumana. So the idea of inference in Indian thinking in this time period, or pretty much as far as I know, all time periods, is that it's tied to epistemology. That's a fundamental idea that I don't think we're going to be able to get away with. The idea is that thinking about reasoning is thinking about reasoning as housed in knowing about the world. Okay, and as we'll shortly see, that comes apart from what's going on in Western philosophy. So the one thing that we know here is that we might not have an easy time if we use this definition convincing a Western logician that we're talking about the same thing. This is the problem of non-sufficient similarity between different cultures. So if what it means to talk about, so I'll just give an example as a book. There's a book by Shesterbatsky called The History of Indian Logic, basically, volumes 1 and 2, I think. And a lot of my friends, how many volumes are there? 4? There are 4? 4 volumes maybe? Yeah. So a lot of people tell me when I show them this book, my friends who are logicians, they say, I'm sorry, but this book, 90% of it is not concerned with anything I recognize as logic. So this book is mistitled. And I'm like, come on, give it a chance. And so we read it together, and I'm like, okay, after all, I'm like, honestly, yeah, it's mistitled. The idea that you're going to get a Western logician to think somehow that discussions of testimony, which are found in Shesterbatsky's book, are really going to be good notions to discuss in the space of logic is just a confusion. There's a logic of testimony, but testimony is part of epistemology, not part of logic, as a Western logician discusses it. So this idea coming from Indian philosophy, although it's very powerful and I accept it, I don't believe it's the best foot forward to make this conversation happen. I think, in fact, it might make people think it's too different. It's just not worth it at all. At best, we can smash each other and see what comes out of a discussion like that, but we're not going to find some kind of productive ground. But doesn't make it the end, because there's another notion. So another alternative that we find in Jainism, and maybe not in the Nyaya theory or in the Buddhist theory, maybe not in the Nyaya theory, but in the Buddhist theory and the Jain theory, is that there's a sense in which anumana, inference, or logic in this sense, tracks epistemology and ontology as a study of reality, right? So in another presentation of this paper, a friend told me that, in fact, Saptabhangi oftentimes is talked about in an ontological sense, that it's giving us something about the ontology of the world. Well, it turns out that one of the most important and revered logicians of all times in all cultures, Gottlob Frege, who is basically the father of analytic philosophy, had the same view. I mean, one of Frege's greatest things that he ever said, that people who like Frege talk about endlessly, is that he talked about logic as the ontology of the world. I mean, one of the most famous things he ever said is that a concept is not an object, and an object is not a concept. He had a very famous sentence: the concept horse is not a concept. Now, that very same paradox is actually found in Chinese philosophy. It's called the white horse paradox. It's not exactly the similar, because there it's about plural quantification structures, but there's a similar idea here. And what Frege was telling us when he said the concept horse is not a concept, which is a true sentence, is the fact that anytime something is in subject position in a subject predicate sentence, the thing that's in subject position must denote an object, and what's in predicate position must express a concept. So when I say the concept horse and put it in subject position, I'm now denoting an object. But if it's really a concept, it's never an object. Concepts and objects are fundamental to the differentiation of Frege's ontology. So it sounds to me, if Frege thought that logic was partly ontology and epistemology, there seems a very productive conversation between the leading father of analytic philosophy and Western discussions of logic after Aristotle with Jain philosophers. Because as I've been informed, Jain philosophers thought that logic, to a certain degree in the Saptabhangi, was an ontological and epistemological thing. So I find another common ground here for discussion. Okay, so now it might be useful to move away from bridge building and talk briefly about some textual evidence. So far, I've mentioned some names, and these are the names that have come to me from certain scholars. But when I began this talk, I said, I came here to learn from you. And what did I mean by that? I meant that I can only work with Jain scholars and Indian logicians and Indian metaphysicians in India who do research in Sanskrit and Prakrit to learn how to see what the texts say, because I myself cannot read these, and I myself need help from you. So I have come here to learn that, and I will return to do that. Now, the textual evidence I have comes from this discussion between Maniki Anandi and Dharmakirti. And basically, in this text, he says the following: inference is knowledge of the target property by means of knowledge of the evidence property. This is a Jain logician speaking. Now, right away when I see that, and I think about what's going on in analytical philosophy over the last 40 years, I can see something relevant right away. And that thing is the difference between epistemic and non-epistemic notions of validity. So for example, in analytic philosophy and in English, we have a principle. It's called the closure principle. The closure principle in epistemology tells us that if I know that P is true, and I know that P implies Q, and if I base my deduction on my knowledge of P and my knowledge of P that implies Q, then I know Q. This is called multiple premise closure. It's a very important principle. It might sound trivial to you, but why is it important? Because we think all scientific knowledge grows in part through inference. When we do a scientific experiment and then we want to learn something from it, what do? We infer from it. But if we're inferring new knowledge, we need a principle that transfers the knowledge gained in the base case to the other cases. This is why the closure principle is important. However, the closure principle in analytic philosophy is highly controversial because the closure principle leads to simple forms of skepticism. Like, I would like to say right now, I know that there are people in this room, but I can't rule out the fact that all the people looking things in this room are really cleverly disguised mannequins, right? So since I can't rule that out, which is a skeptical hypothesis, I don't know that there are people in this room, right? So closure in epistemology has negative consequences when conjoined with skeptical hypotheses. But we all want closure because you don't live in a world where you just make a scientific experiment and you never try to infer from it. But this is different because in Manichaeyanandi and in a lot of Indian philosophy, it sounds like this idea of separating out inference from knowledge isn't really done. Because look at the way this is phrased. Inference is knowledge of the target property by means of knowledge of the evidence property. That means, to me, in some sense, I'm sure there's some way in which I'm wrong, but at least to me initially, that reads as saying the following. What's going on is that we don't discuss good inference outside of the concept of knowledge transmission. So does this initial state transmit knowledge in the second state? So that's called an epistemic account of inference. A non-epistemic account would be something like, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Most of the Western logicians working in logic work with a non-epistemic account of inference. Sometimes they build a logical system in what's known as epistemic logic, where they talk about logic epistemologically. But for the most part, they don't really do that. So this text shows me that there's evidence for an epistemic treatment of inference in the Jaina texts. Okay. Akalanka. So another text that's discussed is the Akalanka. It says, indeed, it is not possible to know essence and causality without the conjecture of the impossibility otherwise. Notice the use of knowledge of essence and causality without the knowledge of impossibility otherwise. Again, it seems like the idea that we know essence and causality through inference is in part related to this idea that we know something about what would be impossible otherwise, right? So there's a treatment, and actually, the reason why I find this particular point in this text very interesting is because before I ever came to studying Indian philosophy, I spent most of my life working on one topic, which is how do you know what's possible and impossible? That is called the epistemology of modality. Now in this text, I'm finding that the idea of knowing essence and causality is tied directly to knowledge of impossibility otherwise. The conjecture notion here is a notion of tarka. So tarka seems to be relevant in the Jaina tradition. So again, there is the big point in epistemic notion here that's relating to the logic, and also how we understand what it is even to be valid. So the scholar that I'm using and primarily working with in terms of text stuff before I begin initiating a discussion here in India is Marie-Helen Guris, who works in Belgium and in Birmingham University. She says in one of her papers, in the Jain tradition, invariable concomitance is known by a separate cognitive process, a conjecture that grasps the impossibility to be otherwise, which is the Jain equivalent to the Buddhist triple characteristic of evidence. In this line, whereas Dharmakirti grounds the validity of invariable concomitance on ontological relations, Jain philosophers consider that the only means to establish the validity of the invariable concomitance is the direct conjectural grasp of the impossibility to be otherwise. The Buddhists favor an ontological version, the Jains favor an epistemic version. This seems to me powerful philosophy of logic. What did I say earlier? The intuitionists created the logic and the rules based on epistemologically thinking about the significance of logic, right? What did classical logicians like Aristotle do? They did it on ontology, right? So I'm seeing a mirroring relationship between the Jain Buddhist structure and a distinction between what comes out of the classical tradition and the intuitionistic tradition. Okay, once again, in conclusion, the main motives identifiable in respect to the constitution of Jain philosophical identity with reference to the question of inferential evidence is first, the fact that the search for necessity does not invalidate inferences based upon worldly phenomena, thanks to the regularity granted in Jain cosmology. And second, the fact that the direct conjectural grasp of the impossibility to be otherwise is the means to establish the validity of invariable concomitance. So the first point that's being made is that oftentimes, I told you, when we're thinking about validity in inference, we think about necessity. We think, oh, if an argument is valid, it's because if the premises are true, the conclusion is necessarily following from it, okay? So here, what they're saying is that their whole account of inference is not invalidated because they don't talk about necessity, because their cosmology guarantees a regularity of a certain kind that accounts for the necessity. Of course, the kind of necessity here is a different one than the one that we find in Leibniz, but it's okay. The point she's making is that we don't have to think, oh, they didn't understand at all the concept of good inference involving necessity between the premises and the conclusion. It's just rather that their cosmology guaranteed that when one thing held about the premise set, you got something about the conclusion. That's my interpretation of what she's saying. Okay, good. So now we are in a position to answer our question. Our question was, how does all of this Jain stuff bear on this debate that I presented? Option number one, the Saptabhangi, in some way, deriving from its basic core ideas, gives us another alternative logic. So just as you have classical logic, and you have intuitionistic logic, and paraconsistent logic, you have this thing which some mathematician will probably work out at some point called the Saptabhangi logic, okay? Which will have rules and everything that comes from these core ideas. Now, this idea is plausible, but I don't think it does anything. And I don't think anybody working on this debate would ever be interested in this idea. And the reason why is because this exercise is an exercise in formal logic and formalization. It's not an exercise in the philosophy of logic. The exercise in the philosophy of logic has to be about generating plurality, not constructing the different system. So constructing a system based on Saptabhangi is just a mathematical exercise equivalent to creating a formal abstract language based on textual evidence. That's not a philosophical argument for why pluralism or monism holds. So this view does not touch the philosophy of logic. There's another there's another way to do it, which is to say that because the system that the Saptabhangi has a difference between truth, falsity, and unsayability, the Saptabhangi offers us different logical constants. So the logical constants that we typically recognize in Western philosophy are negation, conjunction, disjunction, material implication, and if and only if, biconditionals. Those logical constants don't have as a constant unsayable or inexpressible. So maybe one contribution that we get from the Saptabhangi and exploring it is that we get more logical constants. This view suffers from the exact same problem as the prior view, because this view is also only helping us understand how to construct a logic. It's not really telling us something about the specific details of the philosophy of logic. This is what we're looking for. So the first two, although I'm very happy about them, I'm not sure they speak to the philosophy issue. Okay, so one thing we can think about that is useful, though, is the idea that I expressed through the textual evidence. That is the idea that in some sense, these traditions, this tradition in Jainism, is telling us about the relationship between logic and knowledge. Okay, so it's telling us that when we make inferences, good inferences are not only something about necessary truth preservation, but there's something about knowing about the world. It's knowing about the world that matters. So this, I think, is a very important idea. And in fact, I told you in the beginning that one of the people who had talked about logical pluralism, Hartree Field, had in fact discussed the idea that there might be different norms and our logics function in different norms, and we get logical pluralism because of our norms. Now, the norms he had in mind were actually epistemic. He is an advocate of epistemic normativity as a way of helping us understand how logic can be plural. So, one thing that I think we could do is we could try to see, and this is a project that's not filled out today, but it's something I'm going to fill out, is an attempt to see whether or not Hartree Field's view of epistemic normativity is actually a way of filling out the Jain philosophical contribution to logical pluralism. That is one of the techniques that I'm working on right now. So that's one of my suggestions. It's not, I'm not going to develop it in much detail here because I'm still working on it, but it's one of the ways I think things could go. Okay. Okay. But this immediately leads to a question that I find very interesting, both about how Jainism functions in terms of its basic principles outside of the Saptabhangi, and also something that we can think about just strictly in terms of logic. So we don't have to say that the Saptabhangi automatically favors logical pluralism. It might sound like that's a good thing. It might have sounded like all along, all Anand wanted was for Jainism to be a logical pluralist tradition because they're pluralists about a lot of things. But in fact, that's incorrect. I don't think that's what I want at all. In fact, it seems to me that you can actually be a monist, logically speaking, of a very interesting kind. So this move here on this slide has nothing to do with Jainism, but it is a place to interpret Jainism. So the idea in a monist system that's different from the monism that's being advocated now is that you can have what's called a master logic. A master logic that has various sub-logics within it. And the master logic tells you for some certain specific domain of reasoning, you should use this logic. It's like someone who gave you a toolkit and said, by the way, if you have a hammer, if you have a nail, use a hammer. If you have a screw, use a screwdriver. If you have a bolt, use a wrench. The toolbox is the master of everything, and the guidebook tells you which thing to use where. So you can interpret a logical pluralism inside a monistic system by adding a principle that says you should use those rules which are most effective to the task at hand, just as you should use those tools in constructing that are most effective to the task at hand. So if the task is A, then L. If the task is B, then M. If the task is C, then N. This principle added to a logical theory would basically allow you to say that classical logic, intuitionistic logic, and paraconsistent logic are all part of one master logic, and the master logic has a principle in it, and that principle just says you should use the tools that are best for knowing about the things you want to know about. And the analogy with the hammer, the wrench, and the screwdriver is that those are each usable in different things, but they're only effective maximally in one. Hammers are best for nails, screwdrivers are best for screws, and wrenches are best for wrenches. You can hammer with a wrench, you can't screw with a hammer, and you can hammer with the screwdriver. They're effective most when they're used for what they were built for. Logics can be understood in the same way, and they can be housed in a master toolbox with a guidebook. This version of monism is a potential option for Jainism. Jainism could be offering not a pluralistic theory of the kind that Hartree Field is arguing for, but one that takes epistemology seriously by putting it in a master toolbox. Okay? Now, one way to see why I hold that view would take much longer, so I'll just table it for now, but that's one interpretation. Okay, final interpretation now. So, sorry. So, yeah, so, okay, yes. So the second interpretation now goes back to Carnap. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and not use the strict logical pluralism monism move that I just made, But rather what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how Saptabhangi is part of a tradition. It's housed in a darshan of which Anekantavada, Ahimsa, and Aparigraha are all main principles. And what I want to do is I want to say that maybe if we look at Ahimsa and Anekantavada in the right way, we can find another pathway to pluralism via the relationship between Carnap and India and these two Jain principles. Okay. So Motilal said this very famously about intellectual ahimsa in Jainism. Non-violence, abstention from killing or taking the life of others was a dominant trend in the whole of the Shramana movement in India, particularly in Buddhism and Jainism. I think the Jains carried the principle of non-violence to the intellectual level and thus propounded their Anekant doctrine. Thus, the hallmark of the Anekant doctrine was toleration. The principle embodied in the respect for the life of others was transformed by the Jaina philosophers at the intellectual level into respect for the views of others. This was, I think, a unique attempt to harmonize the persistent discord in the field of philosophy. So, look, I honestly, in some places, people think Motilal just has to be wrong. In other places, they're like, yay, Motilal, he's right about this. I don't want to really debate the Motilal thing if he's right. But he gave an interpretation which is usable, and I think we ought to consider it. And I don't think his book on this topic is like completely like something we should ignore. It's rather something we would pay respect to. So I don't think this is bad to use what Motilal was saying. Okay, so there is an issue though, and that is how do you interpret the word toleration as it occurs in Motilal? There are two different schools. There's one school of thought, and that school of thought says that the best way to interpret it is by linking toleration in Jainism, because of where it was occurring, to the notion of toleration in John Locke in his essay on toleration in the 17th century. So the idea is to interpret the notion of intellectual ahimsa as having a form of toleration that is equivalent to the doctrine propounded in the 17th century by John Locke in his essay on toleration. However, John Court has argued that that's absolutely implausible because this type of toleration that John Locke was talking about in relationship to the religious diversity in England at the time is completely different than the type of religious conflict that was occurring in India. Because there's a difference between the type of religious conflict, it's inappropriate to use the principle of tolerance from Locke. Ergo, Locke is not a good thing. And many people actually casually who advocate for intellectual ahimsa say, what Locke was talking about, the Jains got there first. But it might be the case that that's actually the worst thing to say, because the kind of thing that Locke was going for is exactly not the kind of thing that the Jains were going for. And in fact, I think that Court has a very good point here. I think we should be sensitive to the historical context. The alternative is Carnapian toleration, because Carnapian toleration is not about religion. Okay, so the idea is that in logic, there are no morals. Everyone is at liberty to build up their own logic, their own language as he wishes. All that is required of him is that if he wishes to discuss it, he must state his methods clearly and give syntactical rules instead of philosophical arguments. I believe that this idea of toleration is bereft of anything about religion, and therefore it's safer to use the idea of toleration found in Carnap as a way of understanding intellectual ahimsa as applied to the domain of logic. So you can imagine a Jaina saying in a certain voice that when I say I'm tolerant of other views about logic, what I'm saying is that you're free to build whatever you want to. I'm not going to stop you from building the logical system you want to. What instead I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, what is it good for? Because that was the point that Carnap went for. So the Jaina is in the position of saying, build what you want to build. Bring it to our conversation. But what can you do with it? Okay? Because the common human experience is the struggles we have, such as suffering. So we want tools that help us deal with that. So you go build what you want to. But then when we come to discuss how to help ourselves, it has to do some work that we all care about. The hammer is useless that can't hammer in a nail, because that's what hammers are essentially for. Okay. So are so open-minded that your mind falls out. This is the old joke. How can you be so open-minded? Because if you're that open-minded, it must fall out. So if Carnapian toleration is this widespread total toleration of everything, then it would lead to accepting everything, and it would sort of like just not have any boundaries. Hopefully, no, not hopefully, thankfully though, there's a paper coming out in one of the leading journals in Western philosophy called Mind, where Saul Kripke, although he's dead, is publishing a posthumous article in which he argues that it's impossible to have complete toleration. And the reason why is because there are certain logical principles that you cannot adopt. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to choose this logical principle and help build my theory. The reason why you can't choose them is because in order to adopt any logical principle, you would already have to have this logical principle. So some logical principles are so basic that you can't accept them because they're necessary for accepting any logic. That's the idea. So I believe that whatever view we take of the Jaina position on toleration in logic, it must be sensitive and probably will be sensitive to this very limit point. The idea that you can't accept. I don't think it's fair to say Jaina philosophers just accept everything because they're so tolerant. I think actually Jaina philosophers are intolerant to a certain degree in their tolerance. And I think this Kripkean result against pure toleration of logics is the same kind of thing I would defend in the case of the Carnapian interpretation of Jaina. Okay, so what's the conclusion? Saptabhangi is a contribution to logic as an epistemological ontological inquiry, where the notion of logic must itself be constructed from Western and Indian ideas being brought together. Saptabhangi either favors a route to a kind of monistic pluralism about logic as a tool that is normative, goal-oriented, and is sensitive to epistemic norms of inquiry that change in different areas of inquiry, or it fits under Carnap's idea of logical tolerance as an interpretation of tolerance within Jaina philosophy. And again, let me just close by saying this. Although I've said a lot, I have actually come here to learn. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, sir. Yeah, sure. So definitely you presented a wonderful paper on logical pluralism and the Jaina's contribution towards it. And it was a comparative, balanced, and so rich in its content. And now the session is open for the discussion, but sorry, since we are running out of time, so only we can have 1 or 2 questions. So, sir, please, Dr. Pramod Kumar Bagre, please, sir, come.
First of all, congratulations on such a lucid and enlightening lecture. I'm immensely benefited from your lecture, but I want to point out one incongruence in your lecture. The object of your lecture was to propound logical pluralism, but this is my hunch that you ended by establishing logical monism of pragmatic logic. The master logic you talked of is nothing but pragmatic logic in disguise. And since you come from America, and America, in American context, pragmatism is a main philosophy that defines America. So I think there is some kind of incongruence between what you have said. And second, when you spoke of Locke's conception of toleration, when Locke was talking of tolerance, he was talking of intra-cultural tolerance, because England was a Protestant country, and the question of how to tolerate the Catholic Christianity. So it was a kind of intra-cultural conflict that he wanted to be tolerant about. But when we talk of toleration, we talk of intercultural toleration. So this is my observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just let me clarify. Nothing that you said is like what your question reveals to me is that I need to clarify further one of my points. I said towards the end, it sounded like I wanted to defend logical pluralism, but in fact, I don't have an agenda about what Jaina logic should end up saying in this debate. Rather, what I have are some suggestions and an exploration. So I was trying to suggest that insofar as I can find a way to make pluralism fit in a monistic structure by adding a principle that sorts in specific domains for specific logics, that the Jaina view would be open to that as well. I wasn't saying the Jaina view is pluralistic and I ended up with monism. So the thing is, I just did not clarify enough for your purposes what actually the goal was. So the goal is only to say, here's another option. When I come back next time, I probably will have it all settled in my head. But this one was part one. You have to wait for part two. The second point that you made, so personally, I just want to clarify, I am not from America. I was actually raised in Saudi Arabia. I grew up there. So, and I traveled all over the world when I was a young kid. So I consider myself a cosmopolitan philosopher by my upbringing. I went to an international school. But it is true. My main training in mathematical logic was at one of the foremost institutions of it, the University of California, Los Angeles, and I studied there. So it is true that my understanding of it. However, my whole philosophical training, I have always hated pragmatism. I am not a pragmatist at all. I think pragmatism is not a good philosophy, and I do not advocate for it. So I would have been shocked to find out that the upshot of my talk was that somehow pragmatism was going on. Rather, what I would say is this, is that Carnap, who taught at UCLA at one point, advocated for a view under which logic is controlled by pragmatic concerns in one dimension and not in pragmatic. So you can construct what you want. That's the pragmatic free view, pragmatic free. And then when you want to go do something with it, well, then what can it do? That was the analogy with the wrench, the hammer, and the screwdriver. So yes. Now the lock point is correct. You're right, actually. In fact, I promise you that next time I present this, I will make your distinction because it is correct. Locke's difference from the one in the Indian tradition, which Court is arguing for, is that he has within a domain toleration, and we want cross-domain toleration. And you're absolutely right. So thank you for correcting me. I believe that your correction is what I will use in the future. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
So there are some online participants as well. So one question is there in the chat box. May I read it out for you, or you may take up there? Of course, sir. So Dr. Rajan has raised a question. He's asking that how does logical pluralism applies to the famous laws of thought, which are known to be categorical? The first, the law of contradiction, the law of excluded middle or third, the principle of identity. Is taking up all these three laws. Sir, wherever you are comfortable.
Okay, so if I what can we discover about the consequence relation if it's true that our mind operates under certain laws of thought? Now, the way the question was raised, though, it almost assumed that the laws of thought are what has been said to be the laws of thought. But some would argue that those are not the laws of thought. So two questions. Are there laws of thought? Probably yes. This also comes from the idea that just as there could be a universal grammar, there could be a universal proto-logic that we all have in our minds. So it's a Chomskyan version done not for grammar, but for logic. But then the answer would be something like, okay, how do we understand developing consequence relations in different ways when our mind goes a different way? I don't have a particular answer to that, but I think it's an excellent question. We should pursue that, and we should think about that.
Thank you so much, sir. I think Rajan must have got his answer. Sir, maybe take one more question.
Yeah, I can take as many as you want.
Actually,
I
sir,
would-
we have to start one more
Yeah, I know.
lecture.
We have to go to the
Presidential. Sir, Professor Jha, please come, sir.
Well, it was really a wonderful lecture. And I'm very happy to see that you are not only here to defend, partially, but also to learn. So I would like to draw your attention to one facet of Jain philosophy and metaphysics, which is very closely related with their epistemology as well. Maybe that will give you an opportunity to look at the Jain, logic, entire scheme of logic in a fresh light. You see, usually Jain epistemology is understood in terms of Anekantvad, Saptabhangi Nyayavad, but they also have a very important, philosophical point that there is the concept of Keval Gyan. Now, Keval Gyan is actually the culmination of spiritual disciplines, and it gives you omniscience kind of situation.
Correct.
And as far as Saptabhangi Nyaya is concerned, it is always partial. It is always relative. So the absoluteness of truth, if there is anything like that, certainly cannot be attached to any judgment that is rooted in Saptabhangi Nyaya,
right,
or even in Anekantavad. But if you think of the Keval Gyan, then there is something very absolute related about it.
Right.
Now, the bigger question, which is probably something to be related to the philosophy of logic, that how should we relate these two things or situate these two aspects and kinds of thought processes? Because, there is always the possibility that some people can attain that kind of higher spiritual position, and so that the Keval Gyan is accessible to them, and still they are living in this world. Obviously, they are having judgments and they are having forms of knowledge, but it would be of the Keval Gyan type, it was omniscient kind of knowledge. So how is that omniscient kind of knowledge structure and the logic that is embedded in that to be understood in relationship or in contrast with the ordinary kind of Saptabhangi or phenomenal kind of logical structure and thoughts?
Okay. So yeah, so definitely the part that you're talking about Kevalian and the omniscience is something I'm aware of. Actually, I didn't talk about it a lot today because, as you pointed out, there's two different issues. One is like, what is the logic of omniscience? Right. So that is actually a topic that I've talked to Purushottama Bilamoria a lot about. He likes to talk about omniscience in Jaina philosophy. So the Saptabhangi is not structured at the level of the omniscience. That's absolutely correct. That gives us an interpretation of it. How do I think this is relevant to something I already said today? The answer is very clear. Another version that I didn't discuss today is that we can just forget about the logical pluralism debate for a second, and we can just say this. Let's assume that Gillian Russell is correct, that logic is not about how we should reason, but it's a description of something in the world. And she says it's about truth preservation. Maybe the Jainas have a position in the logical descriptivist view where they would say, yeah, it's about partial truth because we're not omniscient. And then there's an argument to suggest that their epistemology and metaphysics through the Saptabhangi reveals that logic isn't the study of necessary truth preservation, but it's the study of this other thing that's partial and variegated and consistent with Anekantavada. That's actually something that I thought about on my plane trip here, like all the way to India in December. I was like, should I talk about this also? I already have 47 slides. Maybe I should, but thank you for asking me because now I have an opportunity to say, I do believe that's another interpretation. All of it is just a way of saying there are multiple interpretations, work needs to be done with scholars, and I am here to learn. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Sorry, we can't take any more questions now because, sir, we have to start one more lecture and a presidential remark is still here. We are waiting for, sir. So, sorry. Okay, sir, I don't have any issue. Uh, I personally don't have any issue since. Okay, go on, please.
Go, ask.
Come.
Just scream it.
Thank you so much, sir. First of all, I thank you, Abhinav Tiwari. I'm a student of philosophy, and I'm doing PhD in philosophy. So, first of all, I would like to say one thing. That I mean, you have mentioned the pluralism in the discussion. In Jaina pluralism, I mean, the thought process when we apply certain modality and certain magnitude of thoughts, that could be applicable to the functional world, but that would be ineffable in the world of logic, because I mean the same problem occurred when Bertrand Russell, I mean, he responded in a letter to Frege, Gottlieb Frege. He says that pluralism is good thing. When we say that concept is different thing and object is different thing, that's okay. I mean, that could be dealt in the functionality of the world when we have to be open to the all kind of interpretation. But it has enunciated certain problem regarding the logical modality. That's why he says that when we have to remove the bewitchment of language, then we have to anticipate a certain kind of language that could be meticulously dealt in the private language or a symbolic form of language that is very perfect. And there's a very generative principle of grammatology in semantic structure. So in that sense, we are circulating that problem over the period of time. I mean, we are not trying to resolve the problem of pluralism in logic, not in functional reality of the world. Because in reality, it's good to be pluralistic, because we must be tolerant, we must be open to interpretation. But in the logical structure, that would be, that would create a segment of problems that would create a generative grammar problem that has been dealt by Chomsky as well. So what would be your remark in that regard? So I would like to know that. You getting my point? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I heard 2 to 3 different points. So let me begin with the first one. It is true that sometimes there's a feeling that when you put things in a formal system, you are doing 2 levels of violence to something. One, you're doing the violence to having it written out in like language where metaphor and other aspects of meaning have free play in the imagination of the subject. And at the second level, because you're coding language into a formal system, you are actually doing violence to the way the world is, insofar as language sometimes makes the world appear in a way in which it's not. This is exactly what Frege was talking about, but it's also what Buddhists talk about. Buddhists are very much into the idea that sometimes when we say things, we falsify the world by making it seem like there are universals out there. So Buddhists don't hold that there are universals out there. But sometimes when we talk and I say, there's 5 people in the room, that means there's this category called people that's a universal that 5 people fall under. But there are no universals, so language, again, kind of fiddles us. So your first point seemed to me like you're saying, logic will rob us of something because there are levels of which we're removing something that seems more true than what's revealed in logic. As far as I'm concerned, that's just the way the game works. So it's true what you're saying, but I don't know that it's necessarily a problem, because logic isn't the tool that's supposed to be used for revealing everything. It's the logic that's it's the tool that's being used to tell us the connections between things. So remember, a saw is not going to be the greatest thing to hammer with. Don't try to do something with logic that it isn't really designed to do. That's my first point to the first part. The second point of what you were talking about that I heard had to do something with this relationship between what is going on with Frege and Russell. Now, that's a technical point in the history of analytic philosophy. I don't know if I share exactly the same intuition you have about what went on between them, but at least part of what you were saying seemed relevant to the question in the first question I asked, which is Russell rejecting in Frege something because he's saying pluralism is okay, but then saying something like, Frege, I don't accept that? I'm not aware of the place where Russell said this stuff about pluralism, so I would have to be appraised of that. So the second one, I'm not sure what I would say about it. In terms of the Chomsky point, I think it might be that we talked past each other. My Chomsky point was that just as we can have arguments that suggest that there's a universal grammar that allows a person who's learning Mandarin versus a person learning Malayalam from ages 1 to 3 offers the best explanation for why they can learn it given the poverty of stimulus accurately by the age of 3. That's how you postulate the universal grammar. There could also be a constraint on logic. So Robert Hanna at the University of Colorado defended this view by arguing that just as Chomsky might be correct about language, there is something called a proto-logic, which controls the space of logics that we actually can learn. And now the point that I was using was to say, just as the Jains might want to say, which I think they do want to say, not everything is something I'll tolerate, because some things I have to be intolerant towards. Our minds are already structured such that we can't learn every logic, just as Chomsky would argue that we can't learn a Martian language if it doesn't have a grammar that the universal grammar can sort for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you for everything, for your excellent presentation and this question answer session. And now I request our chair of the session, Professor Mukhopadhyay, sir, for his concluding remarks. Hand over the mic to sir.
Pluralism and logical monism. This is not really very recent, but comparatively recent. But towards the end of it, he brought this Jaina Saptabhangi and Nyaya and inference so close that all my enthusiasm, my positive enthusiasm, was almost vanished. The reason I'll tell you. But come to the basic points. He has 2 points to make. One is to rather make us aware of some very important discussions and debate going on, particularly in the West, about logic, and that is between the debate between pluralism and monism in logic. But he is one of the very few persons who at the beginning made it very clear that when you speak of logic very without any clarity, actually we should do in such discussions, philosophical discussion, 3 types of things going on logic. One is formal logic, the other is philosophy of logic, and I should also add philosophical logic. And these 3 is to be distinguished when we discuss about pluralism and monism in logic, how to understand it. And secondly, his agenda was that, and it was a very good agenda, I think, to relate somehow the contribution of Indian thinkers in the related field, I should not say immediately logic, related field of reasoning, to the recent debate in the Western philosophy. I always believed that this should be the way of doing philosophy. That is, we have to intervene in some ongoing debate in the Western philosophy if we are to make any real contribution. So it is not that just comparison, that they are doing this and we are doing this, and no, that is not the case. Actually, there should be some ongoing debate, and if we, from our own standpoint, can intervene profitably and also meaningfully to that, I fully agree with this. But then, think about the pluralism of logic. He knows the vast literature. The most important point is that most of the people who defended or in favor of logical pluralism, they do not mean anything and go in logic. Not that. That pluralism has some restriction. It is not that anything can go for logic or logical consequence. For example, Carnap said that yes, there can be deviation and different interpretations, but if it serves some purpose, you can go that much if it serves some purpose that. And in spite of this concession, there has been a difference between the teacher and the student. Teacher was Carnap and student was Quine. Quine, even then, though he is open to the point that even logical proofs are revisable, it is not that constant, still he did not agree fully with Carnap. He wanted still more restrictions, even what Carnap considered was not enough. One said that those who look at logic in the spirit of a game, they do not have any understanding of the fundamentals. That is his statement. So what was that fundamentals that we have to keep in mind? Come back to Carnap's point that there must be some purpose. The reason is this: there is a great difference between a formal system and logic. In formal system, you have much more option, much more liberty to vary and change and invent, but not in logic. What is the difference? Often we forget that formal logic is not formal system. It is not just a calculus. Unless a formal system is backed up by an interpretation, then that is not a logic. Logic, a formal system, has no truth, no falsehood, no true statement, no false statement, but a logic has. But the logical relationship or consequence relationship is given in terms of true and falsity. Why? The reason is this, that in two ways the logical consequence can be defined or understood. One is purely formalistic system, but that will not do. But if we simply say logically valid inference is that which falls or which obeys the logical rules, then the question is which are logical rules? Only those which permit all and only valid inferences. So there is a circularity. To avoid the circularity, we have to define logical consequence semantically. So introducing the notion of truth, falsity. This is the reason. So the question is, what purpose was there? What purpose this formal logic served? That is why such logic was given. Now there are two. One purpose that was there to serve was to make new foundations of mathematics possible. Aristotle invented logic. But why? Because there is already a culture of debate in the political context at that time. And because that political context already men used to reason and reason validly, reject invalid reasoning much before logic was invented. So reasoning and awareness of correct reasoning and false reasoning, incorrect reasoning was much older than the logic itself. So at the time of Aristotle, the reasoning that was in the society going on, that was in the context of political debate. But in 20th century, there's a new debate came for which a new logic was needed. And that new debate was the foundations of mathematics, which Frege discovered and found that this foundation, in order that we can give foundation to logic, we need a new logic. Aristotelian logic will not do. So it is for this purpose that the standard logic, standard moral logic emerged. But then, when is it the question of pluralism became so important? Let us take their case. When quantum mechanics, with this principle of uncertainty, developed, then it was a great problem that how to reconcile the standard logic and also the modern Fregean logic with this situation, how to meet. For both ultimately traditional logic and also Fregean logic believes in the principle of bivalence. Apart from other roots of philosophical logic, principle of bivalence was a hardcore of that philosophy. But if this cannot be shaken, opened up, then the quantum mechanics cannot be tolerated. So the question was, how much can logic tolerate in order to become useful for the purpose? Now the purpose is not to give foundation to logic. The purpose is to give sense to the quantum mechanics. And then this particular logic started again changing. And at that changing, the time becomes that how to change, to give up the bivalence principle. So there should be a logic which can tolerate even the giving up the bivalence. And when you change the bivalence rule or drop it, then you also change the notion of negation as also disjunction. You have to change that. So now, original interpretation, which could turn a calculus into logic, and the interpretation, a new interpretation, is different in that. In new interpretation, you have to give new interpretation to the logical constants, logical operations, logical relations, such as consequence logic. Now, it is because of this link between the change in logic, opening up the logic, and what is going on in the field of science, that is to be understood. In India, thinkers who took cognizance of Jainism and also of this new logic, they were mainly physicists. D.S. Kuthari for the first, and then afterwards, Prashant Mahalanobis, he was the founder of the statistics in India, and third, much later, Partho Ghosh and T.K. Sarkar, apart from this Jaishankar Shah. So the purpose was there always, and to meet the purpose, so question was how much we can rather become open and tolerate. So question of toleration comes here. If the purpose is there, then for that purpose you become tolerant, is acceptable. But if you do not do that, then you allow anything to go, then better not do any logic. Give it up altogether. So that was the thing. So in India also, what happened? Two things. One, on the one hand, that there was physicists, etc., who found that this
logic should be too restrictive to allow quantum mechanics to function actually. So in the way the Hegelian logic started allowing certain things, so also this quantum mechanics started doing it. So in India, they at that time probed the possibility of Jainism coming to our help, and if perhaps we accept Jaina logic, then it could go. But at that time, they were aware that Jaina logic was a different sort of logic than the logic of Nyaya. They knew it. And that is why, at the same time, there another question arose, and that is the question, what is the relationship between the standard Freudian logic, most probably standard logic, and the Nyaya theory. So a group of thinkers started formalizing Nyaya logic in the standard logic of the West, following Engels. First, some tried in rather inaptly to formalize Nyaya logic into sentential logic, but that did not work. Then first order predicate logic, they tried to do it. But those in India particularly should know that it all started around 1960s. And by 1970s or 75, all these people stopped doing it. At that time, Barlinge, Shivjivan Bhattacharya, and many others, Fritz Stahl, all were doing formalizing Nyaya logic or Nyaya inference in the first order predicate logic. Then all on a sudden, they all stopped. The point is this, nobody told us why they stopped it, why they abandoned it, why they give it up. If they did it, then that would have been very instructive. Why they failed, why they stopped. But they stopped that. So now the question comes back to non-standard logic, and that is to suit quantum mechanics, they fall onto Jain logic. But the point is this, and at this point, I am drawing your attention. You started very carefully, not using the word Jain logic, but towards the end you did once or twice did it. It's very bad, and I'm very unhappy. For in the main texts of Jainism, if you look very carefully, there are two words. One is Nyaya and is Noya. The word Noya, some believe that is only Jaina people think it. No. Even in the Vaisheshika system, in all Indian philosophical system, this expression is common, Noya. But Noya is absolutely nothing to do with Nyaya, number one thing. And this Nyaya is not inference. So there's again a very great mistake that as if Nyaya is inference. Nyaya is not inference, and Noya is not inference also. More than that, this inference that we have in Jain is absolutely the Nyaya logic or Nyaya theory of inference. So in the Jaina tradition, particularly I am Sitambar, I don't know about the Digambar, sect much, but Kundakundan, I don't know this. The point is this, they say that there are two fundamental different categories in Jainism. One is called Praman and another is called Noy. And inference comes within logic. That is within inference, within what is called epistemology, as he rightly pointed out. So, the Nyaya is one of inference comes within Pramana. And one of the Pramanas is inference, but Nyaya is not inference, Anumana is inference, Nyaya is not inference. And logic, similarly, logic is not inference, logic is a theory of inference. In our system also, the theory of Anumana is a theory of Anumana and not Anumana itself. Now, having said this, one of the fundamental differences that we must note is this: when in India, the attempt to formalize neo-logic or neo-inference in the first order pedagogy failed, they somehow, some of them at least, try to say, no, Indian logic is not formal logic, it is epistemologic. This is again a wrong use of the word epistemic logic. Epistemic logic does not mean that logic where logical relationship between two episodes of knowledge. Epistemic logic means that logic which accounts for the epistemic terms. Epistemic terms are evidence and incorporation, etc., etc. Now the point is this: they said that this particular logic, because it is not logic, it is a logical relationship is not between sentences. They must be between two episodes of knowledge. It is wrong. Indian system, Nyaya or in Unumano, is not a relationship between two sentences. They have different words for it, abhayavas. The Nyaya made up of abhayavas, and the abhayavas are all sentences. So it comes very close to the Western conception of inference. Inference is a set of a finite set of sentences, of which one follows from the rest. That which follows is the conclusion, and the rest is the conjunction of all the premises. There may be 100,000 premises, but they can be all conjoined. So the one conjunction, one premise. So that was this. The relationship essentially from the time of Aristotle till now, that is, inference is essentially a finite set of sentences, the relationship between sentences. In India, it is not between sentences. It is between the knowledge that the sentences no, not between knowledge. Then what about it? The relationship between two knowledge, for example, which corresponds to the premise and which corresponds to conclusion, the relationship is causal. Causal relation is not logical relation. There is temporal relation. So the relationship is not that. What then is the relation? The relation is about the things. So it is not the heel has smoke. With this sentence, the heel has fire. Also, the relationship is not between sentences, not between the knowledge that this sentence expresses, but with the thing smoke and the thing fire. So that is the difference relationship. Now, when you come to the Jain, the Saptabhangi, Noyo, of course, is not Pramano and not Unumano. In Unumano, they follow totally the Nyaya inference. Even the Sarthanuman, Parathanuman, they take from Nyaya, and the inference, the definition, all they give from there. And that is the relationship of Bhakti. So, relation of Bhakti is not a formal relation between or causal relationship, but it is a relationship between two things by virtue of their properties. So, while I agree that there must be some very important points to say in Jainism, but immediately I do not think that it can help supporting logical pluralism, but it may have some relation. I have not thought about it. You are best to explain that. But these things have to be kept in mind. So when it was a question of giving foundation, we have to make logic open. So Russell, who made Frege famous and also who devastated Frege both in life and his logic, was Russell. And Russell wrote a chapter, Logic is the essence of philosophy, with which I disagree anyway. The logic is not essential. Maybe it is essential for philosophy of logic, but not for philosophy. Philosophy much more. It was his but this point, even this point is accepted, then my only conclusion is this, that while I agree, as he is doing a full support need, I congratulate him, that actually to compare and to contrast is not important. Important is to intervene in the ongoing logic, ongoing debate in one culture with our own apparatus and contributions. That much is all right. With these corrections, I congratulate you very much.
Uh, Thank you, sir. And you are so amazing in scholarship as always. And one day for sure, we will be very much proud of ourselves that we had heard you in person. And since we have another lecture, like we'll start it, the second lecture of Chokolingo lecture series. So nobody will move from here. And so exception is always there. So we are at the end of the session. So I request Professor Mukul Mehta sir, who is the chairperson of Bhagwan Sheryansnath Jain Studies Fund, to provide a vote of thanks. Sir, please come.
Thank you, Dr. Niti. Respected Professor बैठिए सर अरे अभी तो बैठिए ये उसी का धन्यवाद The respected Professor Mukhopadhyay sir and Professors Anand Dvau. I was looking for another Anand, but he's missing. So, and all my dear friends. Yeah. So it was wonderful deliberation by Professor Anand and a very scholarly and fruitful comments and by Professor Mukhopadhyay. I just wanted to say a few points, but I know you don't have time now. So only regarding this fund, I'll say that a recently created Bhagwan Sheryansnath Jain Studies Fund that has provision to invite scholars from abroad, to send scholars from this department or from this university to abroad. And not only teachers, but also research scholars. There is a provision of that in that fund. Along with that, there are several things, and we have requested Professor Daniel also to be under that program here, and Professor Anand Ji also I have requested to be here again for a couple of weeks after June, because you will have some time in June. So again he will be with us with his scholarly presentations. So there are several provisions under that fund. We have provisions from for conferences, for seminars, for meetings, and for some courses also. So maybe in future also we will be, and I thank Professor Anandji and the whole department, all the teachers of the department, to accepting the association of the fund with the department. So this fund will work as a younger brother of this department in future also. So so with these words, I would like to thank you all for being here and for attending and participating in this lecture under this program. So thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks to you too, sir. And we are going to take a short break and we'll be back here after 5 minutes. Thank you, everyone.